Today we are reviewing Katrina Baby's documentary on HBO Max. If you have not caught it streaming there, and it may actually also be available on here on YouTube as well. But we're reviewing how we saw this huge storm, this impact, of course, the children and also the families. And can there be potentially some parallels between Katrina and this pandemic and how we're seeing too that children and also adults are struggling still because of what they experienced through the traumatic event with Hurricane Katrina and even through the pandemic. Let's get started. Of course, if you have not seen the documentary, spoiler alert, I will be going into great detail about what was discussed in the documentary as I do in all of my reviews, but just want to give the spoiler alert. Don't want to catch anybody off guard who's new to this channel. If you think about August 2005, where were you? Where were you? Think about the time. It's summertime, the end of summer, maybe getting ready back to go to school. 2005, where were you? Where were you? That is when Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans and the neighboring cities and completely devastated the area. We learn now, some 17 years later, how much that storm impacted that region and specifically New Orleans. I remember watching the coverage and being obsessed with the coverage of Hurricane Katrina and the people who were struggling to survive the storm because I had lived in New Orleans for 2 years of my life. I went to Xavier University for 2 years and loved the city. Love the city, embrace the city. It has its own culture. It has its own vibrance. It has its own language. It has its own music. Like New Orleans does not care about how everybody else is doing it. Like it just doesn't care. It has this very homey feeling. It's very slow, very intentional feeling, but also very homey and very connected. And the food, amazing. Absolutely amazing. And the music, it's like no other, from the jazz to bounce music. That was New Orleans specifically at the time that I was there. All of that chopper style, all of that was happening, and I fell in love. And because of that, I was hurt. I was hurt about what was happening to these people. And of course, they looked like me. And so when this documentary came up in my notifications, Katrina Babies, I had to watch. I had to watch it because it's looking at the babies and the children who went through the storm and how it impacted their life and how it's still impacting their life 15, 16, 17 years later. Just to share with you guys first some statistics about Hurricane Katrina. It was a Category 3 hurricane. However, because it caused the levees to break on the shore of New Orleans, that is truly what caused so much damage to the city of New Orleans. About 25,000 Louisiana residents and New Orleans residents sought shelter at the Superdome, the infamous Superdome, after Hurricane Katrina. The total damage from Hurricane Katrina was estimated to be $176 billion as of 2021. The population of New Orleans, according to the census of 2000, was estimated to be 484,000 citizens. That fell after Hurricane Katrina, as the next census in 2006 fell to 230 residents of New Orleans. In the most recent census that we do have, the estimated population is 376,000, which still isn't back to the original population, which was almost 500,000 people living in New Orleans. It is noted that 70% of the housing was damaged in New Orleans. 70%. That's 134,000 units, housing units, that were damaged due to Hurricane Katrina. So that lets you know just a little bit about the damage of Hurricane Katrina and what it did to the inhabitants and to the city. Now, this documentary is talking specifically about the little ones that were impacted by Hurricane Katrina. Life after trauma, as this is definitely what we would describe as a traumatic event. Trauma is simply defined as a distressing event, something that is distressing to you. And I will just add too, is when what was can never be again. There's a swift and abrupt change that our mind, our bodies have to adjust to. And there's a grieving process that happens right there. And there's also processing time that's needed in order to truly take in what has happened. As our brains look for stability. They need stability. And as we heard by so many stories of the people who were interviewed during this documentary, is that New Orleans was a city that definitely found stability in the city. These people didn't move. They didn't leave. Again, they didn't see a need to. They didn't see a need to move. They stayed there. And oftentimes, too, especially when it came to evacuation of a hurricane, they didn't have even the resources to evacuate. I can even attest, because also the children were talking about when they heard that the hurricane was coming, they said we joked. We joke all the time about hurricanes because they do happen often. I lived there for 2 years, and oftentimes they had hurricane warnings, and I would have to choose to either stay or leave. And oftentimes, to be honest with you, I stayed. I think I left maybe once or twice. And one of the times I remember actually listening and asking residents of New Orleans, like, hey, so tell me about these hurricanes, because I'm noticing this is a thing. This keeps happening. And I remember one gentleman telling me, I played basketball during a hurricane. Like, they come, they go. It's just a part of living here, right? It's just a part of living here. And I do believe that that's what we do sometimes. We try to see, okay, is this something that's normal? Is this an everyday occurrence? And that sometimes, because we are used to certain things, storms happening on a regular basis, pain happening on a regular basis, hurt happening on a regular basis, our bodies adjust, our brains adjust to the pain. It becomes white noise. It becomes something that just becomes a part of the norm, when it could be something that we do need to attend to. And definitely, I can even attest, I remember walking from my dorm to my friend's dorm during a hurricane, to the point where when I got there to my friend's dorm, I was drenched. I was completely drenched. I had rinsed out my socks because they were so wet. I had to walk back to my dorm once the storm passed. And I remember like having my clothes just like in bags. And it was so heavy because there was so much water in it that it being over my friend's house, it didn't even dry thoroughly. Like, it was just so much water, and the rain was coming like from here. The rain was coming like diagonally. It was coming like shooting up. It felt like it was just coming from everywhere. So that storm was not anything like Katrina. And so I could only imagine what it was like for the individuals who stayed, thought that you didn't have to leave, or had no choice but to stay because they couldn't leave. One thing that I saw that was very profound throughout the documentary was each child. They remembered the feeling, the sounds, the smell, anything that was connected to the storm. They had a very, very vivid memory of it. And oftentimes that is truly how we experience trauma, through our senses as we are going through it. And that's oftentimes how we are activated or triggered through our senses. There's a smell. The author or the director of the documentary, Edward, he talked about how he remembered going to his cousin's house before, because that was a safe space for him and his family, going to his cousin's house before the storm happened. And he remembered that she cooked rice and gravy, and he could remember the smell, and that it felt like home, that it felt like safety there. There was a young man who talked about remembering the panic, the sound of panic of his mother's footsteps as she was coming through the house saying, "Hey, we gotta go." Remembering that from age 11, remembering that, something that happened 17 years ago. Our brains, they hold on to these memories, and at the same time too, our brains sometimes will create some distance from them so that we can continue to move forward. We can continue to adapt to the life after trauma, right? And it's not until we sit and talk about these children, we're sitting and talking about these stories, that these memories just kept coming back and back about where they were, what they saw, what they heard, what they felt. Betty Buckles, the mother of Edward, talked about how she remembers seeing the mayor. She remembers seeing the mayor come on the TV and say, hey, you guys, because he knew his city and he knew his people too, that, hey, you guys, this isn't the storm to stay. Please, you have to go. And she remembered seeing that and saying, okay, I'm going to listen to him and I'm going to go. And just having these very vivid memories of what happened, how they responded, how it made them feel. One girl recounted that because their house was in the lower ninth ward, it was below sea level, that her grandmother told her, hey, we have to go. And she remembers grabbing her things, rushing out the house, and hearing the screams outside, and seeing the water rise and continue to rise, and having that memory of that, and again, how it made her feel. She remembers actually hearing the levees break, hearing the crack, hearing the boom, and her uncle rushing to the house late that night saying, hey, we have to go, and seeing a man in a boat and rescuing them. Like very vivid memories. And even for you, as you are hearing this, you may even be experiencing and re-experiencing some memories of witnessing this hurricane, as that is definitely what happened to me as watching this documentary. All those feelings like came rushing back, because when we start to recount what happened, those parts will remind us how it made us feel, what it was feeling at that time, what we were thinking at that time. Like, oh, I thought we were going to be okay, or I thought we were going to die. I thought my family was no longer going to survive this. And these children and their families started to share this story, it brought them right back to that day in August 2005, when they were scared, when they were afraid. And I can't help but draw parallels between this situation and the pandemic. We've been in this thing for a minute now, right? And just think about in March of 2020, or whenever this became a very hard and scary situation for you. What were you feeling? What were you thinking? And how have you protected yourself? How have you created some distance from what you experienced, from what you witnessed, from what you saw? Just thinking about that. So many children were talking about what they saw, seeing a dead man in a street and wondering if she was going to be dead, and wondering if her family was going to make it out. She remembers going to the Superdome and seeing people sad and just sitting there, and the smell of human waste, and not knowing and even questioning for her, is this real? is what I'm experiencing real? I've never seen this before. Her brain was in a space of shock. And she really wanted to cry. But she also said no one talked to her. No one talked to her, and no one ever asked her how she felt and how this made her feel. Because in those moments, I am sure that the one thing that her family was focused on was survival. The one thing that her family was focused on was just making sure they were able to take care of themselves as best they could with what they had at that time. And you hear so many other children who were asked these questions, who were interviewed. They said no one asked. No one asked me what happened or how I felt or what happened impacted me. No one asked this question. It's so common. Oftentimes, remember, our minds are trying to create space from what happened, trying to develop some sense of normalcy, and even still in a state of survival, as putting their lives back together after the storm and trying to survive. That's what their minds were focused on. And so I imagine that even trying to connect with their children to say, hey, are you okay? And their children saying, yeah, I'm good. That asking even more clarifying questions may have been something that would have made them uncomfortable, or they may have been nervous to do that. Right? But just asking that surface level question, it made them say, okay, I checked in. And at the same time, I'm curious if they were to say, how are you really feeling now that our lives are different? How are you feeling now that our home is gone? How did all of this make you feel? If they had like a family circle and said, okay, what we went through was so much. We went through so much. We saw so many horrible things. Let's sit and talk about it and what that was like for you. I'm curious what would have happened if they would have got the same answer or something different. I remember this girl, her name was Sierra, and she talked about how she remembers packing up her things, and she was just packing up some little stuff like, hey, I'm going to get some pictures and this and that. And there was a part of her that said, I know that in 1 or 2 days, we're going to be back. We're going to be back, and everything's going to be fine. And then the storm happens, and her family comes back to the house to get the rest of their belongings, and she was expecting for them to come back with everything she left. She was expecting for them to come back with everything that she had left, and they only had a half of a trash bag of their belongings. And so she was thinking, okay, so where's the other stuff? And they said, no, this is all we had from the house. And that was the moment she said that she felt that she knew that her life was forever changed, and nothing that she knew was the same anymore. That's grief. That's loss. That's loss at a very young age. And then how to navigate. We know we have a part of us that's oftentimes very concerned about the unknown. Our minds like stability. Our minds like knowing. Not knowing, ambiguity, that can cause some disturbance internally, some fear internally. And that can show up in a lot of ways. Again, likening to the pandemic we experienced, about the ambiguity, the unknown, all these questions, how long we keep getting these orders to stay in our house, when will we be able to travel, when will the kids be able to go back to school, when will I be able to see my family, all these unknowns and all this ambiguity, and what that activated inside of us: fear, panic, anger, survival. We saw it. And that you saw as well, definitely during this documentary. Cousin Tina talked about how after the storm, she felt lonesome. Because her family was so separated, people evacuated, some didn't, some went to the Superdome. Everybody was so scattered. She felt lonesome and she felt sad. And she said there was a time where she even stopped combing her hair. She stopped taking care of herself because it was causing so much sadness inside of her. There was a part of her that was grieving the loss of connection that she had with her family, grieving the loss of her home, her city, grieving so much, so much. And so she was able to note that because she's an adult. But I'm curious if the children had language, right? Like had emotional language for what they were experiencing at that moment. During the documentary, they definitely had that and was like, oh, I was afraid this was happening at this moment and it scared me. But I'm curious if in the moment they didn't know what they were feeling. They were just in a state of shock, as a lot of them talked about. Cousin Tina also recounted how she remembers the water rushing into her home, the walls in her house shaking, and how she used singing to calm herself for 2 days as they were waiting for help. And then a boat came to get them, and then once she got into the boat, she realized and she saw that her house was the only house standing left in her neighborhood. Tina's children recounted their experience from their view, stating that they felt like it was a movie, again, in shock, not knowing this is real. This is something that has never happened before. So their brain did not have any tools at that time to help them navigate this. So they're like, this is unreal. Felt like this was a movie. And her son said, I thought I was going to die. I thought I was going to die in this house because they were sitting there for 2 days waiting for help. They also showed the little one that we saw on our television that you could not forget. If you watched the footage of Hurricane Katrina, you saw this little one. And she transitioned. Her name is Ariana now, and she talked about she was scared. She was scared, and she was advocating for her grandmother. Thought her grandmother was sick and was going to die because she had diabetes. And she was like, we're in the Superdome. We don't have any help. We need help. We need help. She was scared. She was scared. Many of the teenagers talked about how they had to leave. They had to leave and relocate to hotels and even relocate to another state, and how that was so challenging and disruptive for them because they had never left New Orleans their entire life. Never left. That's all they knew. And one gentleman talked about how he was called, and remember being called a refugee. And I remember that language being used as the newscasters were documenting the people who were natives of New Orleans, of the United States of America, but were being called refugees. And how he said, I'm not a refugee. I'm from America. I'm from here. And it was almost like there was a part of the world that was trying to separate themselves from these people, right? These people in need, and saying, oh, look at these refugees. They need help. They're not us. They're not us. They couldn't be seen as us because most of the people were black. And we do have this byproduct of slavery and dehumanization, and how seeing black people as less than, as refugees, as not a part of us, the human race, then, okay, calling them refugees or looters and saying that, it creates some distance. It doesn't make me a part of them, and therefore I can create some distance. I can protect myself from my emotions of seeing these people in this state, right? One boy also recounted being teased by other kids as he was after he relocated. He was like, oh, you're a refugee. You're a looter. Because that's the language, right? That's the language that was being used to describe these people, these humans looking for help and needing help. Another teenage girl talked about how she relocated to Texas, and the principal said, hey, so do you feel like you're going to fit in here? And what I heard in that language was that principal having a concern about her fitting in here, like almost knowing that that's going to be a challenge for her. And so he asked that question, right? He spoke to that part of him that had that fear. And she said for her, she was like, of course, I don't fit in here. And she said, I don't want to fit in here. I want to be at home. I want to be back where I was, back with what I knew and who I knew. I don't know any of these people or where I am. My life is forever changed. And that's what I hear in her voice. I hear this part of her that is resisting what happened. It didn't choose for it to happen, right? She didn't say, hey, I would like a hurricane to come and take my house away from me and my family and my city away from me and my friends. She didn't say, that's not what she elected for. And so this part of her is resisting and accepting that. And it's holding anger. It's frustrated. I didn't choose for this to happen, and I didn't want this to happen, and I don't want to fit in. I don't want to accept this and these people that I'm in or where I'm at now. I don't want this. I want what I had. And there's definitely always a part of us that is protecting us from the part of us that's grieving what we had, that doesn't want us to experience the hurt of the loss. And it's fighting and resisting because it wants things to stay the same. It doesn't want life to change. It wants things to stay the same. And so that can be a part of the grief process. And we saw this. We saw this with the children that were in the documentary. They talked about how the schools had lots of violence and fights that erupted in the schools because there was constant battles throughout the school. There was normal teenage stuff, but then there was also parts of children that were angry, that were protecting the sad and hurt and scared parts of them that didn't want their life to change, didn't want their whole world to be taken over and taken away by water, right? Didn't want that to happen and didn't want to accept this new life. Also, one of the things that the documentary showed as they were covering the violence that was happening in the schools, and specifically Houston, that even in the city, that the New Orleans evacuees, they took up 20% of either the victims or the suspects of homicide in the city. One of the scenes that was pretty interesting to me was Edward Buckles. He's the creator of the documentary. He's recounting his experience of school after Hurricane Katrina. And I noticed there's a very interesting view, perception, as he's telling the story, his father's telling the story, and his mother's telling the story. Edward remembers going to school and not retaining a bit of information. He's out, just go, and I couldn't remember anything, which is very, very common after trauma. Your mind is preoccupied with what you experienced, and so it's hard to attend to information that's coming at you. And oftentimes it's a way of it can be a way of distracting, right, from what's happening. It's hard to focus. There's parts of you that are trying to daydream or disassociate from what you experience, or your mind is flooded by what you did experience, and so it's hard to take in new information and really function fully as a student, right? I'm still in the space of trying to process what happened to me and how I feel about it. He said that he was there at that school for 8 months and it felt like 2 years. It felt like an eternity because of how distressing it was to him. His dad, on the other hand, his perception was that he felt like his son transitioned pretty well. He went into sports. Once he went into sports, he was doing well. And he had fun, made some connections with friends, and they were able to transition back to New Orleans. He also did state, too, that he never asked. He was going off of what he saw. And oftentimes that's very, very common, where parents will say, hey, my kid's doing fine. And they think because they don't visibly see them crying, they don't visibly see them distressed or angry, that they're okay. But it's not until you ask. It's not until you ask that you really know. Mom of Edward Buckles was saying, well, hey, he seemed okay. I asked him if he was okay. He said he was fine. So he was fine. And again, I don't think we truly have space or even take time to attend to what happens to us after something devastating or distressing happens to us. We're just focused about moving forward and keeping forward. And maybe if we don't have space for our feelings, then we don't have space for someone else's feelings to really sit with them, especially our children, and how it's impacting them. Like, right? Especially if there's no answers for Katrina, right? We can't unbreak the levees. We can't take the water damage away. It's done. And at the same time, how to be present with these children, and what if that would have made a difference. And even thinking, of course, parallel to the pandemic. If you're a parent watching this, or if you're a grandma, uncle, have you sat with your children and said, hey, I know the pandemic, that happened, and we're still in it, technically we're still in it. We're on the other side of it, but I'm curious, let's talk about how did you feel during that? What was that like for you? How does it feel now that it's over? And what are your thoughts about it? Where are you now that it's over? So many teachers I'm hearing, parents I'm hearing that, oh my goodness, the schools are out of control. These kids, they are not okay. They're distressed. They're acting completely different than they did before the pandemic. Could it be that they're holding things that they don't know how to talk about? Could it be that they saw some distressing things, or they could have been distressed and they're that's still there, but they just maybe not be aware of it and it's coming out in another way? Could that be? And not only just the children, too, like sitting with them, but even sitting with yourself to see, have you attended to the parts of you that have been challenged or were scared or frightened during the pandemic? Have you attended to those parts, and how have you noticed a change in how you respond to yourself and others since the pandemic has happened? Are there some protectors up around there? Something to get curious about, truly. Rebuilding after trauma. After Hurricane Katrina, we saw all the displaced families trying to find space, trying to reconnect. How, specifically to New Orleans, how they identified themselves is by their neighborhoods. Like they repped their place. Ninth Ward, 8th Ward, that was a part of their identity. And wards are similar to like counties in other states. So there's cities, but there's counties as well. And so wards are very similar to that in New Orleans, and that is how they represented. And they also had community there, because again, these families did not leave. And so they knew the family very closely, right? Generations of family knew their grandmothers, sisters, brothers. They were connected, and they often had block parties and things of that nature. And so now that's gone. That's disrupted, and it felt like a ghost town. And people who are normally used to connection and community now were displaced, and their neighbors have relocated to another state or another part of the city of New Orleans, and lost that community. So they lost their home, they lost the community, a way in which they survived. They used to survive. We all need connection. We truly need connection. And this was something that thrived in New Orleans, but was also damaged severely during Hurricane Katrina. New Orleans, of course, is known for its tourist attractions, and people come there for Mardi Gras. They come there for Bourbon Street, the food, all of the things, and that is the livelihood of truly like how they make money, how they generate through tourism. Cafe du Monde, which is a very, very popular beignet restaurant in New Orleans, reopened years after Katrina happened, and they said it still just didn't feel the same. A lot of gentrification occurred as people saw this as an opportunity to make money, and then ownership was taken away. Homes that people had passed down through their families Again, their city that they felt was theirs. Now, other people came in to take away from. Another loss. Another loss. As people were trying to rebuild their lives after Hurricane Katrina, the government gave out FEMA trailers for individuals to live in because they didn't have a place to go. Some people didn't have money to relocate to other places or to purchase new homes. They didn't have anything. And so FEMA gave these trailers. These trailers had formaldehyde in them, and many of the people who lived in these trailers developed tumors and cancer because of living in these trailers. And we see this, right? Trauma on top of trauma on top of trauma, right? Once something happens, then there's layers to it. It adds because you're vulnerable. When you're vulnerable, when there's a heightened level of vulnerability, then more tragic things can happen. It truly can. If you're in a situation where you're living in a city and you need to evacuate, but you don't have money. So what do? Especially if there's nothing in place to help you, to support you. Then you go to this Superdome where you're seeking shelter, and the facilities aren't safe enough and aren't suitable enough for seeking shelter, and there's no support. Support comes, but it is flawed, and it adds more. I'm talking about health trauma. And people are trying to navigate their identity, because I identify with where I lived, and now I don't live there anymore. That's been taken away from me. I identify with my community. That's been taken away from me, and now I am in this trailer. I've been diagnosed with cancer, and I don't want to be defined as the woman who got cancer. As one of the women stated in the documentary, I don't want to be defined as that, when all the other things have been stripped away because of the loss, because of the trauma. Then the question of identity even comes up as to how now do I identify myself, because I don't want this thing that negatively impacted me to be the thing that identifies me. One of the young men, he called himself Mid-City. He said he would go to his childhood home after the storm and just sit on the porch and just sit there. Even though there was no one living there, the house was not suitable to live in, he would just sit there because he was trying to connect back to that part of himself that was there. That's no longer there. It's still inside of him, right? That part is still here and it's grieving, but that part is no longer, doesn't have a space to flourish anymore. And trying to connect with that part by sitting on that porch for hours and just being with that part of him that is grieving that loss. Gentrification and communities and neighborhoods, especially in urban spaces and specifically in New Orleans, because New Orleans is a very unique city. These are people, again, who did not leave that place. That New Orleans is what they knew and the only home they knew. And for Black people specifically, displacement from homes and having someone come in to take their land feels a very, very familiar. And that definitely was something that was activating for me as watching this. It's like, man, we're constantly fighting for ownership because that was something that was taken away. And this storm definitely reactivated that wound, triggered that wound for specifically the Black people that had endured New Orleans, which was the majority, because New Orleans is a very, very Black city. And these people were fighting for territory, even still in New Orleans, as wards and a part of the community and the environment of the wards in New Orleans was definitely that of gang violence. And that increased because people were now trying to to represent new areas and fighting for those areas because no ownership, no territory. That was taken away. And Edward, the creator, talked about how he had made this friend, and he was struggling because he just couldn't, really get the fight to really do well in school, and he was angry, and this friend saw him struggling in this conflict on the basketball court, and his friend told him, hey, this guy told him, hey, don't, just come on, you know the right thing to do. And he took him in, and they made this bond, this connection. It was familiar to the relationships in the community that he had before this tragic storm happened. It's like, now I have this connection again. We're looking out for each other. It's community. So similar. And because of this friend, I believe his name was Jaquez, because of this friend, now I'm able to have a newer sense of hope. I can push through this. I can graduate school. I can really focus on my goals because now I have something to center me, to help, that feels familiar. And then because of this violence, his friend was taken away from him. So sad. So sad that one storm, one thing after trauma, we see life after trauma sometimes becomes a domino effect of another thing happening and another thing happening because of so many systematic things that have taken place, so many older wounds that weren't addressed, so many legacy burdens that we know that unfortunately our country has passed down to us, and oftentimes it causes so much frustration and also a state of helplessness because there's so many things that are surrounding trauma, life after trauma. There's so many things. We even see this. We have to parallel, right? We see this after the pandemic. There's so many things. How hard the Black community was hit with this virus because of the systemic issues, right? The food deserts, because of the lack of education, because of the poverty, all of these things, and how it made them more susceptible to this illness because the neighborhoods were so congested, and so then it was more easily passed because there's only one or two grocery stores in a neighborhood and everybody's going there. It's easily passed to others, and we see what happens. And then on top of this, right, if we already have more susceptible to having mental health struggles, having strained relationships, then more things continue to happen as trauma happens in our world. It's something for us to get curious about if we're attending to ourselves. And no, we don't have control on the systemic issues that are surrounding us. What we do have control over is how we attend to ourselves and take care of ourselves. That's what we have control over. Also, another byproduct, right, of the storm is that a lot of the youth centers, too, in the neighborhoods, well, the resources were they were either closed or diminished or they decreased, which also caused an increase in violence. A gentleman talked about how he remembers being shot several times. And then as he was protecting himself from that he blocked his feelings. He blocked his feelings from it, and he really doesn't attend to himself because it's too much. It's too much to attend to. And also a way that he protects himself is by carrying a weapon. Carrying a weapon so that he feels safe. A lot of the children telling their stories said that it felt so much better to tell their stories. It felt therapeutic to share their stories with Edward as he was interviewing them. And they felt seen. That's what it's about, feeling seen. They felt disregarded for so long, 15, 16, 17 years, feeling discarded by the world, by their families, and even by themselves. And so him taking time to interview them made them feel seen, made them have a space that they could be heard and their story could be told. And it does. It does. It causes a moment of vulnerability, right? To tell your story. It causes that bravery where you have to lean into that to tell your story. But how can you do that if you don't feel safe? If you don't feel safe, if you are always in survival mode, when is there space to be vulnerable? Where is that space? And is it possible for you to be your brave space? Something to get curious about. New Orleans. New Orleans has been rebuilt, right? Technically. And at the same time, it can never be what it was. It can never be what it was. And how do these children, how do these families process that? Some of them are holding on to the memories and trying to recreate them and even memorializing it. Finding space to navigate this, right? Navigate what life looks like after trauma, after Hurricane Katrina, after the pandemic. What does life look like? And making space for you being your brave space to check in and see how you're feeling. Don't want 10, 15 years to pass and someone do a documentary about the pandemic and the children of the pandemic and say, nobody asked me how I was doing. Nobody checked in. I just kept doing my work and went back to school. Yeah, I was scared. Yeah, I wore my mask for a few years and yeah, I got in trouble at school and I didn't really know why. I didn't know what was happening. Check in. I really applaud Edward Buckles for leaning in and being vulnerable and sharing his story and allowing the children who went through this storm to tell their story. It was beautiful to see them in their vulnerability. It was so brave of them to share their pain with us. Now it's up to us to determine what are we going to do with it. Let me know your thoughts. Let me know your thoughts about how you felt about the documentary. What were your reactions for you during Hurricane Katrina? Did you relive those feelings, those memories? Was that activated for you? How was it during the pandemic? Do you see parallels? Between the two? And are you attending to yourself? Let me know. Of course, if you would like to stay engaged with this content as I regularly do documentary reviews, I also am a licensed professional counselor and an IFS therapist, internal family systems therapist. If you want to engage with this information, feel free to peruse my channel. I do have a playlist of all the documentaries that I have reviewed and look forward to engaging with you as you comment below. And I should also introduce myself. My name is Alicia Jackson, licensed professional counselor, and I wish you well. And as always, be cool, be calm, be centered.